Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And in this week's episode, I'm going to be talking about some dynamics around bitters. Bitter herbs have been gaining a lot of popularity over the years, and they're really seen as kind of this magical cure-all, especially for the digestive system. And, sometimes we see out there, everyone should be on bitters because they're so amazing for digestion. And so many people these days have a lot of issues with the digestive system, primarily because our GIs are under assault from a lot of different angles, from antibiotics and all of the food dynamics that we see in the modern world. But what ends up happening is that we overlook some very important aspects of bitters, and how in some situations these can actually be very contraindicated types of remedies for people. So in this week's episode, talking about the appropriate and inappropriate use of bitter herbs and some things to be aware of for how you can use these important remedies effectively and efficiently and in an appropriate way so that they heal and do not harm. So enjoy this week's post. Our first question comes from Jana Nix in the Vitalist Herbal Practitioner Program. And Jana says, at one point you mentioned that one must be careful when suggesting bitters for the dry atrophy tissue state in the GI because it can boost secretions. Then you said that in damp stagnation bitters, it is important to also exercise caution because it has an overall constitutional drying effect. Wouldn't boosting secretions be considered the opposite of drying? Or perhaps not, because we are aiming to balance a dry atrophy tissue state? I would love some clarity here. I hope this makes sense. And another part of the question she kind of adds on, you mentioned that bitters tend to be water soluble. Why is it that so many alcohol tinctures are made and labeled as bitters? Lastly, how does the drying nature of bitters stimulate excretion and enzymes? For some reason, I'm relating the secretion of enzymes to water moistening, thinking of something flowing or creating fluids, rather than the dryness of bitters. Great questions here, Jana, about bitters. And this is a really important question, actually. There's multiple facets of it that I think are important to address and understand. There's a lot of questions in here, so hopefully I'll get to all of them. So just wanting to clarify a few things here. So you mentioned in damp stagnation, it's important to exercise caution because it has an overall constitutional drying effect. So generally speaking, when we're looking at bitters, okay, just to clarify here too, when we say bitters, that's referring to a couple things. One, it's a taste, obviously. Anything that tastes bitter is classified as a bitter. But that word is also a term used to denote a specific herbal action, meaning a specific cascade of physiological responses that occur in the body in the presence of these types of plants. So obviously herbs that taste bitter tend to have a bitter tonic action. So let's kind of go through a little bit about what happens when your tongue, bitter receptors on your tongue are triggered. Well, first thing, there's a large cascade of things that occur in the body here. And the primary one here is their effect on the digestive system. So what we see is that when the bitter receptor is triggered, we see an overall stimulation of the digestive system, specifically in terms of secretions. So that would be in the stomach, hydrochloric acid, enzymes, enzyme secretions in the intestines, mucosal secretions in the intestines, pancreatic enzyme secretions. The liver begins producing more bile. That's commonly referred to as a choleretic action. The gallbladder at the same time is secreting more bile into the small intestine. That's typically referred to as a cholagogue action. And usually anything that's bitter will usually have a degree of choleretic and cholagogue actions. Usually the more bitter, the more significant the cholagogue and choleretic action will be. So we're seeing really the entire digestive system is being prepped to receive food. And this is why bitters are receiving, well, they've been used this way traditionally, but it feels like in the last number of years, they've been gaining a lot more popularity, I guess maybe in more the general public as a means for supporting digestion. And this is really the premise of, the side salad. It's like you go out to eat and oftentimes you get this little, starter salad before the main meal comes. Oftentimes these days it's like, spinach or romaine or like iceberg lettuce or something like that. But back in the day, these were wild greens, bitter greens, greens that have a lot stronger flavor. And if you think about it, a lot of greens that we consume actually do have more of a bitter taste. Things like arugula or mustard greens or a lot of these other dark leafy greens that can be consumed. But the premise of that was you eat a small bitter salad before the main meal in order to prep digestion. So bitters are amazing to support the digestive system, right? They're very commonly used for all manner of digestive issues, gas and bloating and constipation and all types of general GI upset. And that sounds great, right? Sounds amazing. But one of the things that is commonly overlooked is this energetic side of what bitters do, like Jaina is mentioning here in her question, which is that for the most part, bitter plants have an overall energetic quality of, first off, being cooling on temperature. That's why when you take something that's really bitter, you'll oftentimes kind of get a chill or send a shiver down your spine. People that take bitters consistently over a long term oftentimes will feel cooled down. That's just very common. And sometimes that's a good thing for someone that tends to be a little hot. But for people that constitutionally are already cold, that may not be the most ideal. So cooling, they also tend to have a net constitutional drying effect over a long-term period of time, as well as what we might refer to as a downward energetic motion, meaning bitters tend to drain things down and out. So they have a downward movement of energetics. That's why they use to relieve things like constipation. That's why we see helping with bowel movements. Many bitters oftentimes have an emmenagogue action and stimulate menses, again draining fluids down and out. We also see this is why many bitters can also be really great for things like arthritic pain or joint pain, specifically when the joints are really puffy and swollen and inflamed. It can drain the fluids out of a joint. Oftentimes they can drain congestion out of the upper respiratory system. So it's all draining fluids out of tissues and oftentimes out of the body. This is where the confusion can sometimes happen, because it's like, oh, I take a bitter and all of a sudden my whole digestive system is secreting. Isn't that moistening the area? The answer is yes, in the short term. And this brings up, I think, an important consideration in the study of how medicinal plants work. And that is the polarity of the short-term effect on a local tissue versus a long-term effect on the constitution as a whole, okay? So, for example, with a bitter, and this is where you can sometimes see conflicting information in herbal resources, right? Where, you go to one author and it says it's drying, and you go to another author and it says it's good for dryness. And it's like, what? Like, how is that possible, right? How can a drying plant be good for dryness? Well, it's possible that those two different herbalists are looking at the difference between a short-term local effect or a long-term constitutional effect. So with a bitter, short-term local effect, it's definitely moistening, right? You take that Oregon grape root and your whole digestive system starts secreting. But those secretions are ultimately leaving the body, right? And because fluids leaving the body will end up leading to a drying effect. So this is why I always say it's important to really exercise caution in the use of bitter plants, especially for the digestive system, that you got to be a little bit careful if the tissue state is seemingly dry. If there's dryness in the intestinal tract, I always encourage people to work with demulcent plants, things like Althea officinalis or Ulmus rubra or Glycyrrhiza glabra or other moistening demulcent plants that will kind of restore the optimal moisture balance of the mucosal membrane. The bitters are going to, in the long run, aggravate that dryness. So in your question, Jana, absolutely be careful when using bitters when there's a lot of dryness. But if there's dampness, that's actually specifically when we really want to use bitters. So if there's dampness, especially coupled with heat, that's a very ideal situation for the use of bitters. Now, if you're wanting to give, a well-rounded digestive formula, this is why oftentimes you'll see them combined with carminative plants. These tend to be warming, aromatic, essential oil-rich plants that generally taste pretty good, right? Things like peppermint and fennel and angelica. These are plants that generally will warm and balance the cooling property of a bitter. And then you can also add demulcents to that formula like marshmallow root. And there you have a pretty nice, relatively balanced digestive formula. So the bitters cooling, drying, the carminatives warming and drying, and the demulcents being moistening. And that's where you can compound formulas to balance any energetics of an herb that you want to give but may not be compatible with that person. So I think this is, I think bitters can be used in the short term to kind of help kickstart secretions in the GI. I think they can be helpful in that way, but we do need to be very cautious in using them in the long term. And I think this is kind of something that I feel like, is important for us to know as herbalists, because the bitters are kind of sometimes promoted or marketed or seen as this like magic cure-all that everyone should be taking, and it's really not true. Excessive use of bitters can actually cause cold damage to the digestive system. So we got to be careful a little bit there in using them, and just make sure that you're really assessing the local state of the tissues in the GI as well as the constitution of the person as a whole, and that you're really just checking in with them as they're working with the formula. And your follow-ups, you're asking things like, okay, are you starting to feel dry eyes, dry mouth, dry skin? Do you feel colder than usual? Are your hands and feet getting cold? Things like that. So that kind of addresses the first part of the question. Second part of the question about bitters being water soluble. So I would say most bitter compounds are soluble in both water and alcohol, right? Generally speaking, from a plant chemistry perspective, there are three major categories of kind of big picture categories of constituents that tend to have a bitter taste. We see iridoid glycosides, we see alkaloids, and we also see sesquiterpene lactones are kind of the three major categories of constituents that oftentimes have a bitter taste. These compounds, while definitely being water soluble, are also well extracted in a mid-range percentage alcohol. This is why a lot of bitter plants respond quite well to, depending on whether the herb is dry or fresh, anywhere between 40% to 60% alcohol usually will get you a nice bitter extract. And we see that with things like, golden seal, Oregon grape, dandelion root, gentian, greater celandine, blessed thistle, turmeric, lots of bitter plants out there. And generally speaking, a good mid-range alcohol will give you a nice balanced extract, getting those bitter principles. And so, yes, and then kind of the other part of your question there, Jana, being about the drying nature of bitters, I kind of already answered there. So in short, that is kind of the summary of thinking about the effects of bitters on the local gastrointestinal tract, as well as the way they influence the constitution as a whole. And I think it's also worth mentioning here too that, bitters don't just affect the digestive system, right? Oftentimes bitter plants will have alterative actions in helping to cleanse the blood and cleanse the liver, the skin, sometimes the lymphatic system. Oftentimes they'll have other effects on the nervous system, right? The nerves, there's bitter receptors in the nerves, there's bitter receptors in the heart, there's bitter receptors in the vasculature. So bitters are really it's oftentimes we kind of tunnel in and just think of them as affecting the GI, but many bitter herbs are affecting other tissues of the body. Immediately my mind goes to things like blue vervain or motherwort, skullcap, right? Hops. These are very, very bitter plants, and oftentimes they're more closely categorized in the nervine category than they are necessarily in the digestive category. Now, obviously, they're bitter, so they will have an effect on the GI. But things like hops, blue vervain, skullcap, we usually think of those more under the category of nervous system plants, right? And then thinking of motherwort, right? Even more so, very strongly oriented towards the heart and towards the cardiovascular system, along with the nervous system. So I think that's an important consideration, that we don't just tunnel in and think of bitters kind of in this myopic way, but they're actually having a much broader systemic influence on the whole organism outside of just the local sphere of the GI. So great question there, Jana. Thank you so much for asking it, and I think it's an important one that everyone really should really wrap their mind around, so that these really important plants can be used appropriately and effectively.